In 1992, Congress passed legislation designating the entire month of May to celebrating Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Across the nation, we dedicate this time to recognizing the contributions of and the influence of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to our country. Welcome to the Convocations program at Carleton College. I'm your host, Carrie Rott, Director of Events. We'll be together for 1 hour and we'll include time for questions. You may click on that Q&A tab on your screen to present your questions at any time, and I'll pose them to our guest speaker at the conclusion of her presentation today. Sia Her is a cultural bridge builder with a passion for establishing relationships and trust in communities. She was appointed Executive Director of the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans in early 2013. The Council, a nonpartisan government agency, is charged with bridging the gap that often exists between state government and the Asian Pacific community. The Council advises the Legislature and Governor on issues of importance to Minnesotans of Asian and Pacific Islander heritage, and in doing so, advocates on behalf of this community within state government. Thus, the Council is uniquely positioned to collaboratively shape public policy. Ms. Her came to the United States with her family when she was 4 years old. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science from Macalester College and master's degree in public policy from the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Ms. Her credits her personal, familial, educational, and community-based experiences as the main motivators for her work at the Council. These experiences have shaped her understanding of advocacy and policy development. But more importantly, they have shaped her understanding about the importance of politics in people's day-to-day lives. Her work at the Council reflects this understanding and her belief that there is a place for government to assist Americans in improving their lives. Welcome to Carleton College, Sia Her.
Thank you, Carrie. All right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. And again, Carrie, just thank you for that warm welcome. I would start off by just thanking everyone who is following this conversation this afternoon for dedicating some of your time to being here with me today. As Carrie shared, my name is Sia Her, and I am the Executive Director at the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, which is a non-cabinet state agency operating mainly within state government. It's my privilege and my honor to be here with all of you today, and especially the fact that we're here together during Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And given the purpose for our being here today, which is that I'm going to be speaking to a seemingly simple yet complex and increasingly critical issue to America's future, and that's this issue of how to establish trust and relationship with and between America's many communities, particularly within the context of API Heritage Month. If there's been one lesson learned in the past year and a half, particularly for someone in my role within state government, that lesson is that this topic of building bridges across communities is more important than ever before. I don't think that I need to point out too often, but I often do. And it's that where I am today, one of the first thoughts that come to mind is that it's been more than a year since the pandemic arrived on our doorsteps and the beginning of the onslaught of anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes. As an American of Asian ancestry living in the state that I love, the state of Minnesota, and in particular as executive director at the state agency charged with advising and advocating on behalf of Asian Pacific Minnesotans, I am quite exhausted, to be frank. So this year during API Heritage Month, the month that, as Carrie so succinctly introduced, the month that has been dedicated by Congress to recognizing the contributions and influence of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or APIs for short, and the desire to better understand how to build or rebuild trust amongst American communities across cultural, racial, and economic divides are especially poignant and necessary to our collective pursuit of a more perfect union. And I don't think that I'm alone in feeling this way. I believe that all of you who are following this conversation this afternoon share in this belief, which is again why we're all here. So API Heritage Month is particularly important this year for a number of reasons. One I've already mentioned before, and that's that this is the month that across the nation has been designated to celebrating a particular group of Americans and their heritages. And that fact is important because the celebration of API Heritage Month isn't constrained to an individual. Celebrations of our many heritages as Americans from the shores of whether it's Asia, Africa, or other parts of the world really present us with opportunities to build greater mutual understanding and respect. This year, where API Heritage Month is concerned, for me, both in my personal and professional capacity, I feel that it is particularly important because between March of 2020 and this very month, May 2021, I spent more time with community members talking about their anti-Asian hate experiences. In this one period, 1 year's worth of time, I've spent more time talking about this particular issue than I have in the first 7 years of my tenure as executive director. The reasons for these incidents, which we in the state of Minnesota have learned are oftentimes just hateful rhetoric rather than the violent attacks that we've seen across the country, are stark reminders to me and to many others in our community of the imperative for us to collectively face racism and other forms of evils that too oftentimes become the basis for violence against others because of their race, ethnicity, gender, and/or sexual orientation. Our work at the council in Minnesota's various API communities these days reminds me constantly that our community safety is a real concern and that we have much work to do to heal our many communities. And so it's fair to, at this point in time, just to be honest with all of you and say that in my mind, my work as the executive director of the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans is often laced with the state, well, with the touch of being brokenhearted. It's just an incredibly difficult time to be in this line of work at the same time that I recognize that it's quite the honor to be serving in this capacity. As executive director, I am the key staff of a state agency that was created in 1985 by the Minnesota Legislature. And in statute, we are charged with advising the governor and the legislature on issues of importance to Minnesota's Asian Pacific Islander community. We advocate on behalf of this community, and in our advising and advocacy capacities, we bridge this community with state government and with other groups of Minnesotans across the state. We were last restructured in 2015, and when we were restructured then, all of these states, 3 ethnic councils were brought under one enabling statute, and that's often called our enabling statute, or if you want to cite a specific statute, it's Minnesota Statute Section 15.0145. The council was founded in 1985, but I want to provide a little bit of context about the community then. In the early 1980s, the Asian Pacific community was estimated to be about 26,000 strong, which at the time meant that the community was less than 1% of Minnesota's total population. In the 70s and in the 80s, an influx of refugees from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia arrived in the state of Minnesota. These were, for those of you who may not know, these refugees were the survivors of the Vietnam War and 2 less well-known wars, the Secret War in Laos and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So again, in 1985, Minnesota's API population made up about 1% of Minnesota's total population. Where we are in time today is we make up, as Minnesotans of Asian and Pacific ancestry, we make up slightly less than 6% of Minnesota's total population. And slide number 3, which I have in front of us here, depicts who we are when broken down by ancestry groups. This depiction here simply shows you who are the 10 largest groups. Our 5 largest communities are among the Asian, Indian, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the Korean. Minnesota's API community consists of both refugees and immigrants, and obviously their descendants. What many of you may not know, however, is that Minnesota's API community is unique from any other state's API communities in that we are a refugee experience community. And those refugee communities include the Hmong, the Vietnamese, the smaller communities such as the Cambodian, the Lao, and the Burmese. In fact, Minnesota is home to one of the largest concentrations of an ethnic group from Burma, known as the Karen. We are home to possibly the largest population outside of Southeast Asia. The difference between an immigrant and a refugee is important to note for a host of reasons that come into play in the policy realm. And it often comes into play in every conversation we at the council have, whether it's with state or federal or municipal or city governments. To that point, I would share that I am a member of the Hmong American community, and as Kerry shared in his introductory remarks on who I am, I was brought to the United States as a refugee child at age 4. I'm in my 8th year as executive director of the council, and because of how I started my life here in the United States, I have found it especially powerful to be serving in the role of executive director of the council. That's because as a child growing up poor, and in hindsight, as a child who not only grew up poor, but grew up in the shadows of mainstream life in America, I remember that I aspired to someday be in a leadership position somewhere, but for such a long time, I felt certain that that was a vision that would likely go unrealized. I've already identified or called out the need to know the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, and I hope I'm not insulting anyone in the audience by simply reminding everyone that a refugee is someone who is more or less forced to leave his or her native country because remaining in that native country would in fact make someone vulnerable to being killed. Whereas on the other hand, an immigrant is someone who leaves his or her native country in the search for economic opportunities. And so, in this slide here, take our Hmong American community, for example. This is a community that was an American ally during the Secret War. And when the Vietnam War ended in May of 1975, this community became a target for the new government's persecution effort to persecute anybody who was felt to not be in alignment with them. And so this community, the Hmong community, our largest API community, is a refugee community. Up until the 1950s, the Hmong community, the Hmong didn't have a written language of its own. And so in that simple story, you can begin to imagine what that kind of a profile of a group of people, how that profile would set them up to begin and to, really what their American experience would be like. Now, on the other hand, our Asian Indian community, our second largest API community, is an immigrant community. Most of our Asian Indians who, came here prior to the 80s came for educational opportunities. Between 2000 and 2020, this community was the fastest growing community under the API umbrella, and they came searching for opportunities at Medtronic, Ecolab, Boston Scientific. And so in that sense, they came for employment opportunities in the STEM field. And what you'll see corresponding with these two communities is that the Hmong community's median household income is dramatically lower than the Asian Indian community's median household income. So I'll just go back to a little bit more about me, because in the introduction that Carrie shared about me, that introduction was quite illustrative of how my personal background shapes my leadership style, as well as the areas of focus here at the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans during my tenure. When my family first arrived in the United States, my family simply consisted of my parents, my older sister, myself, and my two younger sisters. Today, my family consists of my parents, 4 sisters, and 3 brothers. And I'm glancing at my notes, just wanting to make sure that I touch on all of the key points I want to make with the audience. I would say that our family's journey to becoming who we are today as individuals and as a collective have been one of countless difficult moments, but also with breathtaking moments of success. It's largely with these experiences in mind that I will be speaking to the topic at hand today, which is my work at the Council, particularly as a cultural bridge builder, and consequently what those experiences have to say about recommendations for anyone who wishes to go about establishing relationships with others where those relationships may not currently exist, or where those relationships may need some time and attention so that they become stronger than they were. My hope is that at the end of my time with all of you today, I will have shared a perspective and included some information that you'll find meaningful, eye-opening, and useful. We are living in a time of rapid demographic changes here in the state of Minnesota and across the country. And if the past year and a half has taught us anything, it is that our future is here. And just as we know it would, this future is filled with opportunities for leadership, along with complex and daunting challenges. So I'm going to go back and forth between the slides of my presentation, because I want to make sure that that my remarks are flowing naturally and not necessarily in what you might find a monotonous tone. So at the Council, we know all too well that our nuanced knowledge of Minnesota's API communities and our relationships with members of the community directly contribute to state government's capacity to make policy decisions that reflect the interest of Minnesotans, including Minnesotans of Asian Pacific Islander ancestry. I pointed out earlier that we're the advisor, advocate, and connector. And in carrying out these roles and responsibilities that have been charged to us in state law, we strive to lift up all Asian Pacific ancestry stories. And as I have said in just the brief sentences about my own stories, the stories that we lift up at the Asian Pacific Council are stories of recent refugee groups who are experiencing struggles, and stories of groups who have been in America for generations, such as our Chinese and our Japanese. And these stories from more established community groups are stories of individuals and collectives that continue to find great success. And so what we're really talking about when we say that the Council goes about advising, advocating, and connecting, is we're talking about a state agency charged with the responsibility of telling stories of prosperity and stories of challenges. And our goal at the end of the day in carrying out these responsibilities is to influence both policy and administrative decisions at the state level. You might be asking yourself, well, how does the Council go about advising? Or how does the Council go about advocating? Simply put, much of what we do is we act as a cultural broker. And that's really important to call out because the staff that are on our team, and including me, are often in conversations that feature members from the governor's cabinet to the legislature, and obviously various community leaders from the API communities. in these conversations, our role is to interpret and to help policymakers understand community members and help community members understand policymakers. And in that capacity, we bring to bear upon the conversation that's playing out all that we know about the history and the culture and the characteristics and beliefs and practices of the group of community members that are in that conversation. And at the end of the conversation, we interpret for policymakers what was actually said, even though those community members didn't actually say those very words out loud. We are oftentimes following up in conversations with policymakers and helping to clarify what it is we should have taken away from an engagement with a particular group of Asian Pacific Minnesotans. We focus much of our attention on whether we identified opportunities for further interactions. And if we did our job well and reading carefully the interactions of both policymakers and community members in those conversations, the interactions between those two groups should result in decisions that will in both in the short and in the long run impact the lives of members of the community. And because shared accomplishments are always the result of an understanding between the stakeholders that are involved, what we have actually done in that space and in that initiative is we've successfully helped to build relationships between groups that otherwise might not come into contact with one another. And so our work, that's just an example of how, of what we mean when we say that we're a cultural broker, we're a policy advocate, and we're a builder of bridges. Our work is quite critical, and it's been made clear in the past year and a half that our work is more critical than ever before for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that remains a constant is that the national narrative of the model minority myth is not nuanced enough to explain the reality of Minnesota's Asian Pacific communities. And so when the council is involved in conversations with legislators and with other government officials, we strive to help them understand exactly the reality on the ground for the various groups that do make up the Asian Pacific community. In the realm of public policy at the state level, the model minority myth harms our community because it influences policy decisions that fail to meaningfully address disparities faced by the majority of Minnesota's API community. And again, that's the refugee experience majority. We have seen time and time again that the pandemic, without a doubt, has exacerbated existing disparities and created a dramatic rise in anti-Asian sentiment. The news tells us daily of violent attacks happening on the East Coast, on the West Coast. Oftentimes, those victims are elders, women, and children. That obviously is just heartbreaking. It, more than anything, tells us that our community is hurting. In fact, across the nation, and especially here in the state of, in our great state of Minnesota, all of our communities of color are hurting. Where our API community is concerned, I pointed out earlier that I've spent countless hours just fielding calls and staying in conversations with members of the community, listening to their stories of frustration and fear, and really bitterness and resentment because of what we're seeing happening to Asian Americans in the state and across the nation. In summary, our community is cagey, weary, and frustrated. And this state of the community has contributed directly to a dramatic increase in the work that is available for our council. And in the weight of the responsibility that we have as the agency charged with representing this community within state government. All of this leads me to this point where, I recognize then that, and and obviously across our state and across the nation, I think it's been made clear so far that many of us who identify as Asian Pacific Islanders feel that a time such as API Heritage Month is a critical opportunity for a number of actions or for a number of things to take place. And so because Heritage Month is about things being handed down, including history, we know that we're going to be seeing a series of activities happening across the country, ranging from federal museums hosting exhibits to city governments hosting gatherings. But here at the Asian Pacific Council, we see API Heritage Month as an opportunity to engage in some more meaningful conversations that go beyond what do we eat as ethnic food? What do certain cultural costumes look like? And so I want to take us into this space where we talk about what this month means to members of the community. And so I've already shared that in the past year, our council has fielded countless calls from members of the community. It's just been an incredibly difficult time, but you know, we've had ample opportunities to also engage in some powerful conversations. For example, the racial justice reckoning that happened last year in the very public wake of George Floyd's death. That was a catalyst for conversations that may not have been happening for a number of reasons. And then, of course, the civil unrest that followed the killing of George Floyd, the summer evenings and nights that compelled many members of our communities to talk about what it must have felt like when our parents were, experiencing war in the native countries that they left behind. Most recently, the civil unrest and the impact that that has had on businesses that are owned by members of the Minnesota of our community. I don't know. I would point out that, for example, along University Avenue, API Minnesotans, those businesses, I believe more than 75% of the businesses along University Avenue are owned by members of the API community. And last summer, in the wake of the civil unrest, I mean, we fielded countless calls from members of the community who were incredibly concerned about misconceptions about the community and how that would impact their businesses. And so, I would then also add that most recently, the murders of the 8 people in Atlanta, which we know, that 6 of them were Asian Americans. This tragedy in Atlanta has really deepened the pain and concern that's permeating across our various communities. Again, that is one level of talking about community. Coming back to the API community, I think I pointed out that the community is quite diverse, and that this level of diversity is both a challenge and a strength. The API community is culturally, socioeconomically, linguistically, geographically quite diverse. At the council, we have a front row seat to this phenomenon. We often see the diversity and the differences between our different groups play out in the policy realm. Most recently, we've seen the difference between our various communities play out and policy issues such as data disaggregation. We've also then looking to what happened with our African-American community last summer, we too had a front row seat to the reactions of our community members in the immediate aftermath of Floyd's death. I mentioned briefly already, and I'll just go into some details about it. We heard directly from members of the community who were concerned and who wanted to make sure that they were reaching out to us to express their outrage at the incident and their recognition of the need for justice for communities of color. Many members of the community wanted to make it clear to our office that they expected us to continue to speak to this call for the need to stand in solidarity with our African American community. We also heard and were in numerous spaces where we felt the pain and fear of Asian Americans who, were struggling to find their place in a conversation about social justice, at the same time managing what they were saying in a conversation about civil unrest. And specifically, we heard from members of the Hmong American community who believe that others may have mistaken or felt justified in seeking retaliation against Hmong Americans because one of the 4 Minneapolis Police Department officers and the spouse of Officer Chauvin were Hmong ancestry. Yet, I want to point out that despite the differences between the different API communities, there is a growing belief that we must move forward together as one community, united by a number of things, one of which is our new homeland, the United States. It's fair to say that we've learned many lessons in the last year and a half, one of which for API Minnesotans, one of those lessons is that if we are divided as a community, that we're going to be more vulnerable than we otherwise could be. We've seen in this period of time of exponential increase in anti-Asian hate incidents and hate crimes that to many Americans, we're not Hmong or Chinese or Asian Indian, we're just Asian Americans. And so we have a role and a responsibility during API Heritage Month to move the conversation beyond the food that we eat as ethnic communities, beyond the clothes that we wear as members of ethnic communities. There's a growing consensus that we must engage in more meaningful dialogues about who we are and who we intend to be as Asian Americans and as Americans of Asian Pacific ancestry. Again, that's all based on the premise that exclusion, racism, and other social ills have individual costs, but they are the product of systems that we are all collectively living in, and that we're all held back even when we may not necessarily feel that is what's happening to us as individuals. So, even at a time of celebration, it's important to, I believe, to put this out there that members of the community are fearful, some are angry, many are hurt, almost everyone is anxious. But we as a community at the same time understand quite well that we're just another group of Americans caught in the growing pains of a nation where race has long been a key determinant of one's life chances. And in this, we recognize that our ability to move from surviving to thriving is intricately connected with other communities of color, including our African American community. With this in mind, I think it's also important to point out that members of the community, particularly those in leadership positions, have been quite intentional about speaking to the fact that we as members of the API community cannot ignore the historical trauma of our African American community members, nor can we presume to know what they need. And so, given that that's where we are, we've also collectively concluded that we need to dialogue and we need to do so in a way that builds solidarity so that we can ensure that our diverse communities are leveraging all opportunities to build trust and to build capacity for compassion, and also to just simply become comfortable or even more comfortable seeing one another as allies. We need to stand together to speak in one voice. And I'm just incredibly proud to say that in the last year, we have just seen an outpouring of messages from members of the API community calling for solidarity and camaraderie and really mutual understanding and respect so that we can pursue what we believe to be a better state for all Minnesotans. And so, I would say that for this, for all of what I've just said, that's just my way of saying that there is a broader consensus amongst, and I believe this to be the case, given my role and my responsibilities as executive director. I think there's a broader consensus amongst many Minnesotans and Americans that we have to figure out together how to negotiate our differences and consequently find a way to honor our diverse identities and our collective identity at the same time. And so I'm going to just segue into talking about into recommendations on how, recommendations on how to you might go about building relationships with others who are very different from you. It's already been said in various places and times that Minnesota is increasingly diverse. Here at the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, we believe that a just and vibrant state will increasingly require that all Minnesotans, including you and me, will have to have the knowledge and skills necessary to contribute to our share of the work that's necessary to building bridges that actually help to connect us with one another, which then, if that is the case, that begs the question, what can we do in our own ways to address the obvious gaps that we see these days? And really, what can we do to address the challenges that are so unique to us as Americans from different ancestry groups, from different walks of life? So I have some recommendations for all of you, and these are recommendations that are straight out of the practices that I deploy as executive director, and they are taken, right out of the advice that I give to legislators and other members of government almost on a daily basis. And so, it's one slide in my PowerPoint presentation. And so I would just caution all of you and say that this seems to be an oversimplification of the work that I do as executive director and the work that my team does as a collective. But for the sake of time and because you will have opportunities, you will have some time to ask me questions, I'll just touch on some of the recommendations that come to mind in a simple conversation. So my first recommendation, or the first thing, one of the most important things or most important recommendations that I make to policymakers and others is simply to be present in communities. What this means is that you accept those invitations to be a part of community events, even if you aren't invited and you know that an event is happening, take the time to join those celebrations. Being present inside communities is the most simple and yet time-consuming act that you can deploy, but it's also the most powerful. When building trust is your goal and the intended party is an individual or a community whose norms you are not familiar with. When you're actually physically inside a community space, so say, for example, Hmong Village, you get to see for yourself and feel for yourself what you can't when you're reading a book or a report about a group of people. In person, I believe that it's not just your five senses that are engaged. It's everything about who you are. It's, there's this Chinese saying of like 100 senses, right? When you're in person, you get to see and feel things that you otherwise can't see. And repeated exposure to individuals or to a community for a lack of better way of saying this, in their natural space will naturally and consequently lend to your increasing capacity to just instinctively see the world from the perspective of that individual or that community. It's I think that we all know this through our day-to-day life experiences, that when we are interacting with someone in person, we have so many more cues to work with so that we are better positioned to understand exactly what it is they're saying and what they're not saying, but in fact are trying to tell us. So, don't underestimate the community festival attended, or the ethnic restaurant or store that you've patronized, or the listening session during which an elder tells his story of how he escaped communist soldiers. It's in these seemingly simple acts of being present in front of a community member or in front of a group in a space that is theirs, that you picked up on the nuance, that you are able to most effectively pick up on the nuances that make people uniquely who they are. And those nuances will, not only tell you who these individuals are and what the various chapters of their lives have been like, but these nuances should in time better position you to understand what they have in common with you and with others. I absolutely believe that over a long period of time, if you dedicate the time to being present in communities, you should come to better understand how culture and specific lived experiences shape and reshape people's decisions, whether it's a decision to show up at a protest in front of the state capitol or the decision to come before a committee to testify. I can't guarantee you that you will always agree with the decisions that these individuals or these communities may make, but I can almost guarantee you that you will be better positioned to understand how they arrived at their decisions if you make the time to be inside communities. Second, just be genuine. Being genuine means that you show up more than once inside communities, and you don't just show up when you need something, right? So for those of us who have been students at a particular time in our life, or who are engaging in professional endeavors that involve, for example, a research study, right? So showing up once in a community and asking, and telling community members that you need 10 individuals to participate in your study is not what I mean when I say show up and be genuine. In fact, what I'm saying is that people want to be needed, but they don't want to just see you inside their communities or inside their space because you need them to carry out a specific role or responsibility that would benefit you, right? So, show up often and show up and show up when you don't need anything. And when you do show up, stay for a while. What that means is stay for as long as it is possible, and or if you're in a position to know what a respectful amount of time looks like, make sure that you have created the circumstances that will allow you to stay long enough so that your presence in that space isn't deemed as an act of ignorance or a disrespectful act at worst, right? So I'll tell you a story just to make this even more clear. So I was just out at Hmong Village a couple of weeks ago with some very powerful members of the legislature. And we were visiting, obviously some Hmong American business leaders. And those business leaders were they were somewhat apprehensive and anxious because these were powerful members of the legislature that were coming to visit them. And they consistently said and frequently said to me, we don't expect these legislators to stay too long. We know that they're very busy and very powerful people. And I said, don't worry, we'll work out the details with the legislators and we'll let you know how long we can stay. Well, as soon as the legislators arrived on the scene, the most powerful of the legislators said to me immediately, you tell the community leaders that we're here for as long as they need us to be here. I have the entire rest of the day to be here. I want to learn as much as I can. I want to meet as many people as I can. There's no limit to the amount of time that I'm here today. And we ended up staying there at that business, at that shopping center for about 3 hours. And this was with some very, very powerful members of the legislature at a time when our legislators are incredibly busy, right? But my purpose in sharing this story with all of you is that, when we left that space, when we left that mall, the follow-up feedback from the business leaders in our Hmong American community included statements such as, "Wow, I can't believe that the legislators spent that amount of time with us. They really cared. They didn't just come here because they wanted some photo opportunities. They didn't just come here because they want to be able to say that they came here. They dedicated their entire afternoon to being here with us. We didn't expect that, right?" So you can, in the follow-up conversations that I had with the Hmong American business leaders, I walked away understanding, right, and just quite happy with the fact that because these powerful legislators took it upon themselves to be in the community for such a long period of time, that made all the difference in the world to these community leaders and business leaders. And so that's what I mean when I say, when you are at community events, when you are in someone's home because they invited you in, make sure that you understand what the respectful amount of time is. So staying for a while may mean an hour, staying for a while may mean 3 hours. But take the time to understand that the amount of time you're at or in a space is important in contributing to the message that you leave with your audience, which is that you're genuine about building relationships with them. You're not simply there because you need something out of them. And so then moving on to my third recommendation, really just dedicating time to learning where people have been, because that allows you to build genuine empathy. So what does it mean to, when I say, dedicate time to learn where people have been? Let's take, for example, the Hmong American community, which again is our largest API community in Minnesota. It's not enough that you know that the Hmong fled Laos and lived in the refugee camps of Thailand prior to coming to the US. To demonstrate that you really know this community, you have to have experience and opportunities to travel through the various chapters of their lives, right? Meaning that you've listened to the stories of how they escaped. You've listened to the stories that they have sewn into the tapestries that they call pandao. Listening to the stories and hearing and really seeing the tears that won't fall because they think that shedding tears means that they're weak, but they're actually telling you an incredibly painful story. Getting to really know a people and demonstrating that you know them means that you can feel the pain and the presence, that you can feel the presence of hope behind the pain, right? Or that that the harsh words from a parent to a child is actually love cloaked in fear, because these parents are afraid that if their children don't succeed, that their children will live the very lives that their parents are currently living, which are oftentimes not lives of dignity, right? And so a parent, who comes off as screaming at a child isn't just a god-awful parent. It's a parent who's afraid for that child's future and wants to make sure that that child takes his or her education right now seriously. These are all of the pieces that contribute to community members understanding whether you really know who they are or you think you know who they are, right? And what they want is for you to be able to really understand where they've been in order for you to understand where they are right now, if the goal is that between you and them, you're going to be charting a shared path into the future. Again, understanding where people have been, is about understanding their lived experiences and their cultures and their values, because these are things that influence how people define the issues of their day, the problem statements, the problems that they're encountering. And because these variables do have a great deal of impact on how people go about defining problems, they also then have a great deal of impact on influencing how people interact with others who may or may not be similar to them, and then consequently how people go about seeking help and or building community. One of my final recommendations here, which I think is just absolutely critical, is learning how to hold people accountable without compromising their dignity. In general, when we talk about holding people accountable, it's understood that we're assuming that there are shared goals and expectations already that both parties have a mutual understanding of. What I mean when I say hold others accountable without compromising their dignity is don't assume that you know more than you do about communities. They're very, very complex. For example, we're right now in this space and time, we're seeing protests play out in many spaces. When say, for example, that a parent in the community tells us that they're not going to be showing up at a protest, even though they're incredibly unhappy with the decision made by the government unit, even though they feel that the murder of George Floyd was unjust, they may not show up at that protest, they may not show up at a meeting, right? We can call on them to be our partners in the movement to advance justice for communities of color, but we can't assume that we know them so well that if they don't show up, we have every reason to assume that they're anti-progress, that they're anti-equity, that they're anti-social justice. It's most likely the case that those are not the reasons why they're not showing up, right? And so, if we are quick to assume that they're not showing up because of reasons having to do with their own prejudices against us, that's in the eyes of members of the community. And what we've learned in the past year and a half is that they understand that to be an act that strips them of the dignity or what little dignity they have left in America. And so it's really important to understand why they are behaving the way they are, and recognizing that and being able to communicate to them that you understand why they've made the decision that they have, but then helping them to understand that there are different strategies that they might want to consider if they are going to be a part of the movement to, bring about change, right? And so I would also add to that one of the reasons why, and so if you understand why members of the community may not show up for protests, you might understand that many members of the community still believe in the virtues of our American government. While members of the community understand that the American government is far from perfect, if we understand who they are, right, where they've been, if we're genuine about engaging them, then we'll have learned that many Asian Americans who are here in the state of Minnesota left behind very abusive, very corrupt governments, right? And why did they come to the United States? It's because they still believe that no matter how imperfect the American government is, it is still better than the governments they left behind. And so in that space alone, the accurate understanding is that they still believe in the virtues of our system. And that's oftentimes the premise from which they are launching their words and their actions when they're engaging with us in the effort to understand what's going on and to bring about some level of change. Protesting or engaging in an endeavor where one is perceived to be yelling or screaming or part of a large group, that description is not consistent with the profile of or the understanding on the part of many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders about it's not in alignment with their understanding of dignity. And so those are just bits and pieces that I am giving you to help you understand that we're talking about communities that we're talking about cultural communities, and they have processes that they go through to make decisions, and we may not always agree with their decisions, but that doesn't, we're not helping ourselves or anyone else by taking actions that are perceived by them as stripping from them their pride, their honor, and their dignity. And in general, it's the responsibility of leaders who wish to bring people together. It's our responsibility to frame conversations that make sense for all of the involved parties. And so to that end goal, I would just wrap it up and say it's incredibly important to be present in communities. It's important to be genuine. You may be engaging with members of a community who may be limited in English proficiency, but if you're genuine, genuineness and respect, at some point in time, those are universal languages. Linguistic barriers such as one's ability to communicate, or one's ability or limited ability to understand and to speak in English doesn't necessarily mean that one can't tell when an outsider is being disrespectful or condescending. Again, you and I will be better positioned to reach deep into people's hearts and minds if we demonstrate that we have some semblance of understanding about the journey that they've been on. People are the results of their lived experiences. And that's especially important to point out because it's been my experience that when we are having policy discussions, some people at the table need to be reminded that when immigrants and refugees arrived in the United States, they don't just take off, they don't shed their lived experiences and their cultural perspectives and their values like taking off their old clothes and then putting on new clothes. People don't, immigrants and refugees don't shed who they were yesterday when they arrive at the airport or on at Angel Island. And so it's really with that in mind that I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be, for those of us doing community engagement work, attempting to build bridges across the many divides, how important it is for us to demonstrate that we have put in the time and effort to learn where people have been. And that we respect those stories and those experiences, no matter how different they are from ours. So, those are just, some high-level recommendations from me. If I were in a conversation where someone asked me, what are your recommendations for how to build, how to begin to build trust, or how to strengthen relationships that are already in place? I will just go ahead and bring my presentation to, its final, to my final comments. I would say that the times we're living in are not all dark all the time. I spent some time going on and on about, this issue of anti-Asian hate and, the racial rhetoric, the hateful rhetoric, and the violent actions that have played out as a result of that sentiment. But I do want to point out that we're living in a time when you, me, and others, and our government, whether that's at the state or at the more local levels, we recognize that building bridges to one another is in the interest of the common good. And we recognize that we need one another. API Heritage Month then, is a time that allows us opportunities to step back and to shine a light on our own lives and the lives of people who make up our communities, and really to better understand the state of our country. In processing and reflecting on these various experiences at various levels of our society, we are really building on the historical contributions of those who came before us. We're honoring our ethnic heritage and elders, and we're collectively seeking to better understand the lived experiences of others. So as I conclude my remarks, I would just challenge all of you to consider the ways in which Carleton College and you personally have an opportunity to contribute to building a stronger state of Minnesota and a stronger country for all Americans, so that as we continue to live out the stories of our heritages, our collective story is one of growing strength, growing success, and growing opportunities for those who will come after us. On a lighter note, I did share recommendations on how to go about building trust, but I want to also say, please don't let perfection stand in the way of progress. Act on your conviction, even though you may not necessarily feel at this moment particularly confident about your knowledge of the ways of a group of people, or even a family or an individual. You see before you my final slide, and that's the image is that of a monkey bridge, and you'll see these monkey bridges throughout Southeast Asia. A monkey bridge is a bridge that's made of little more than a few pieces of bamboos, with one or two supports in the water, as this picture clearly shows. But I want to assure you that no one should mistake this bridge for being a bridge to nowhere. They're all over Southeast Asia, and they're very useful, and they were built with a purpose in mind. So a bridge, however frail it might look right now, is still a bridge. It is better than none. And with that, I will just conclude by saying, let us continue to forge and strengthen bridges to one another, not as a form of charity to one another, but really as a testament to our mutual understanding that our future, our fates are tied together. And so with that, I thank all of you for your time. And I hope that you'll take the next 15 or 20 minutes to ask questions, because I really did go quite fast through some of those slides. And I feel like now that I'm at the end of my remarks, I feel like I said a lot of things. And so if there is any, if you have questions that, are questions needing clarity, please just feel free to ask me.
Thank you very much. I think you have certainly answered many questions before they were even asked, but to sort of tie in with your closing comments and how we began today, one question was, is the API Heritage Month, is that significant in the lives of Asian Pacific Islander community, or is it merely a symbolic gesture?
That's a great question. The answer is it is absolutely significant, more so today than ever before. We're getting better at it at the state level, but I have been executive director for, I'm going into my 8th year now. And I will say that the answer to that question in a very simple response is that even at the state level, where we think that we are intentional about the policy decisions we're going about, we are still not talking enough about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders when we talk about equity and justice and racial justice and racism. We're not talking about this community often enough. And so API Heritage Month for members of the community as well as for members outside of the community, it's a critically important time not only to remind Americans of the contributions of our community that go well beyond, our work on the Transcontinental Railroad, but it's an opportunity to talk about how the generations of immigrants and refugees were contributing to this country well before they ever set foot on this land. And so to each and every single one of the communities under our umbrella, this month is more than just a symbolic gesture. We're living during a time when we, because of, the governor's executive orders to protect Minnesotans, we're not able to be out and about and, hosting and participating in these various community events. But, in the years prior to COVID, we had plenty of community engagement opportunities. And all of those opportunities were put together with the intent and with the recognition that our stories need to be lifted up more and more, and that we need to be the ones actively lifting up our own stories, because Americans need to know who we are, and they need to know, more than just what has been taught in our, in our educational curriculum up until this point in time.
Can you explain the model minority myth to those who may be unfamiliar with that?
Yeah. So, Carrie, I actually don't believe for a nanosecond that members of our Carleton community may not know what the model minority myth is. It's simply this perception of the API community as a group of people who overcome all circumstances and succeed, oftentimes with flying colors. We think about the Chinese, we think about the Japanese, we think about these large API communities who at this point in time often have generations of wealth to rely on, whose parents and grandparents are quite well educated, and so that's what supports the national narrative about of the API community as a model minority. But as I said earlier, Minnesota's API community is unique from any other state's community in that there is a majority of us who are descendants of refugees or are refugees ourselves. And that's a very, very different narrative. We are oftentimes people who came into the United States after decades of civil war. We are often members of ethnic minorities who were not allowed into mainstream classrooms in the native country. We may have been, surviving in the jungles for the last 10 to 15 years before we arrived in the refugee camps in Thailand. All of this is to say that we are, traumatized. We have had little to no formal education. We may have health issues that have been, long, have gone for a long while as undiagnosed illnesses. And so we are not the model minority. We are struggling. And, this fact is particularly relevant in the realm of public policy as we're making decisions that then are, that are traveling through the enterprise with an X, dollar amount. We just need to understand exactly who it is we're talking about. And the model minority myth is really just that, a myth. It isn't nuanced enough to explain and to do justice to telling the story of who makes up Asian Pacific America.
We do appreciate too the distinction between immigrants and refugees, and pointing out the diverse populations within the Asian Pacific Islander community. All of these groups coming from different experiences and different backgrounds. What can they learn within the Asian community? What can they learn from each other?
Mm-hmm. The most important thing, so we're talking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
The most important thing that they can learn is that we can celebrate the differences that make us uniquely who we are as Americans of Hmong ancestry, Chinese ancestry, Lao ancestry. We can celebrate our differences, recognize and celebrate our differences, but that does not go. That doesn't have to be exclusive of our ability and our responsibility to recognize what the ties that bind us together as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So that's probably the most important thing that they can learn about one another, is that we can celebrate our differences as well as find strength in the ties that bind us. I think what they can also, what members of our community can learn from one another is that we are stronger together. And I know that that sounds really cliche, but I pointed out earlier that the community together just makes up about 5.6% of Minnesota's total population. We are the smallest group when we think about racial communities. And so, you know, our ability to influence major decisions at the state level or even at the county level will be direct results of our ability to work together. So those are the two things that come to mind. You know, both of those answers, you know, are perched on the premise that even as that we at the Asian Pacific Council recognize that even as we're asking non-API Minnesotans to, you know, to get to better know who we are as members of the API community, there's still a lot of learning that needs to be done, you know, by members of our own community about the others in our community, right? So there's a lot that Hmong Americans can learn about, for example, Karen Americans. Our Karen community is the largest and the newest, is the largest emerging refugee experience community under our umbrella. We know some things about them, but we don't know anywhere as much about them as we should. And then obviously, you know, Karen Americans, Hmong Americans should also, there's also the need for them to know who are the Micronesians, right? The Micronesians also fall under our API umbrella. And most of them live down in Milan, Minnesota, but we don't, you know, all that I'm saying is that the different groups that make up Asian Pacific Minnesota also recognize and agree that there's a lot that they need to learn about one another.
Why do you think we've seen an increase in public displays of anti-Asian American bias, discrimination, and hate? And is it an increase, or has it always been there and we're just becoming aware of it now?
Absolutely, I would say that we've seen, you know, this very public increase in rhetoric and violent actions against members of our community because we have had political leaders who, whether they intended to or did not intend to, fanned the flames of xenophobia, and in doing so, because they are such powerful people, they, you know, some Americans saw that very free flowing of words from their mouths as a green light to go ahead and act out on their you know, prejudices and on their ignorance against a particular group of Americans. So there's that. To your question about whether anti-Asian hate has been around, clearly the answer is yes. Racism is alive and well in the United States of America. And so it's not that what we're seeing is new. What we're seeing is just, you know, happening at a rate that we haven't seen before, at a frequency that we haven't seen before. And that's probably, you know, due to the presence of social media as well. But we have every reason to believe that what we're seeing is the result of not only long seething, you know, feelings of bitterness and anger and resentment on the part of some Americans, but really, it's really the result of some of our leaders, particularly those in some of the most powerful seats in the land. And then was there another component to your question, Carrie?
No, but sort of a follow-up question here from one of our viewers. Do you know what organizations or work that is being done to specifically support Indigenous Pacific Islanders? How can we make sure that Pacific Islanders as Indigenous peoples are being heard within the community?
Absolutely. So, I didn't go into details about the makeup of the structure of the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, but our enabling statute calls out for a board, a governing board that consists of 11 members appointed by the governor from the community. And so 5 of those 11 seats are reserved for a representative from each of the 5 largest ancestries, and then 6 seats are reserved for members from the other communities under our umbrella. And so right now we have a member from our Pacific Islander community. Her name is Mati Winey. And this conversation about not just being intentional about engaging and representing the interests of our Pacific Islander community, but in general, our smaller communities is an ongoing area of focus for our community. Now, when we talk about, for example, just several weeks ago, we convened a meeting with our API leaders to talk about how they can, contribute to affecting change in this area. The Pacific Islander community is a relatively small community, and so they have, several organizations, but they are quite small. And so whenever we call on them, what we do is we leverage our existing relationships with members of the community, and we just ask them to reach out to all of the community leaders that they know, and then call on anyone else who wants to be a part of those conversations. We don't, we don't take the approach of going directly to just an organization. But in a larger community, such as our Hmong American community, we do, take that approach of going directly to organizational leaders because it's a large community. It's estimated to be anywhere between 85 to 90,000 strong. And so in a community that's that size, there is a small army of, community-based organizations that are easy to see, easy to call out and bring into a conversation. Whereas in a much smaller community like our Pacific Islander community, we just work directly with community leaders rather than organizational leaders.
Do you think it's appropriate to always group East Asian, South Asian, Asian Pacific Islanders together? Is it not better to acknowledge the differences between these cultures?
I say that it depends on what the purpose is. And I say that, even when we are calling on and designating them as a group, we're never saying, well, at least at the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, because we are charged with the responsibility of being the expert on all of these communities under our umbrella. Whenever we call on any one specific group or we call on the entire community, we never take one course of action over another based on the understanding that we're then not recognizing, the unique characteristics or qualities that make a community, the Asian Indian community, the Pakistani community, or, the Lao community or the Thai community. Does that make sense?
Yes,
yes. We always, to my point earlier about really knowing who these groups are, we actually get to the point where when we call on a community leader, an individual within an ancestry group, we actually also know the personal story of that community leader. And we have a very solid understanding of the extent to which that individual, that community leader's story is reflective of the stories of that respective ancestry group. But I would say again, that's probably a unique, a quality unique to the Asian Pacific Council, since we are in law charged with being the state's expert on all of these communities.
Ms. Her, you've been very generous with your time with us today, and we thank you for your your message, which was informative, it was practical and quite compelling. Do you have a closing comment before we leave today?
Yes, I mean, I always have something to say. I think so highly of Carleton College. When I was looking at which institution I would decide on as my undergraduate institution, I looked at Carleton College, and I think the world of Carleton College. And so it was quite the honor to be invited to speak to this particular community. My research director is a graduate of Carleton College, and she's amazing. So I don't want to assume that every single graduate of Carleton College is that amazing, but because I have known a cohort of colleagues and relatives and friends who are graduates of the college, I just think so highly of you. And so I want to thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about what I know, a bit about my personal and professional experiences. And I want to say, don't be a stranger to the council. We are a resource for the state. My office is funded entirely by taxpayers' dollars. And so the knowledge that I actually shared today, I often tell members of the public that the knowledge belongs to the state of Minnesota. So if you don't call on me, you're not making use of the knowledge that the state is paying for. And so whether you're a student or a college professor, please don't be a stranger to the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans after this presentation. And I also want to say thank you so much for just being so generous with your questions. We are in state government looking at the final days of the legislative session. And so there's a lot on our minds, but still, it's just so important to be able to have these opportunities because as I was talking, I was also, experiencing this very natural form of introspective reflection about who I am and the work that we are doing here at the council during my tenure. So yeah, so those are my closing words. Again, just thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that there will be many more opportunities for a continuation of this topic, or for any other topics having to do with how do we cultivate a state or a people out of so many different people, because the future, if we think things are complicated and complex today, there's only one guarantee, and that's that tomorrow's going to be even more complicated and complex. So.
Well, thank you again, Ms. Her, for not only talking about, but demonstrating what it means to build cultural bridges. And thank you all for joining us today. And our guest next week will be Rachel Sumek, founder of Swipe Out Hunger. So join us again. And until then, be well and be kind. Thank you.